The morning sky above forward operating base meridian stretched endless and blue, masking the chaos about to unfold. Major Kira, nomad, Voss stood at the edge of the flight line, her weathered hands gripping a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the maintenance crews prep the F-35 Lightning IIs for another routine patrol. The desert air hung thick with the smell of jet fuel and determination, but something felt different today. The radio chatter seemed more urgent. The ground crews moved with unusual precision, and the distant mountains seemed to hold their breath. What nobody knew, not the base commander, not the intelligence officers, not even Nomad herself, was that in less than 4 hours, she would become the first pilot in military history to engage a hostile drone swarm with nothing but a sidearm. The locked armory door that would strand her outside the secure weapons facility would seem like a cruel joke until it became the catalyst for something unprecedented. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when satellite imagery detected unusual activity in the Kandahar province. Thermal signatures suggested a new kind of manufacturing facility, something the analysts couldn't quite identify. The Pentagon labeled it Priority Alpha, but the field commanders treated it like another routine surveillance target. They assigned it to Nomad Squadron, the 34th Tactical Fighter Wing, known as the Desert Phantoms, expecting nothing more than standard reconnaissance flights and maybe a few precision strikes on empty buildings. Major Voss had been flying combat missions for 12 years, accumulating over 3,000 flight hours across 3 different aircraft types. Her call sign, Nomad, came from her tendency to take the long way home, finding alternate routes that other pilots missed. Some called it overthinking. She called it survival. The brass tolerated her unconventional methods because her mission success rate was flawless, but they never quite trusted her instincts the way they should have. The first sign of trouble came during a routine morning briefing. Intelligence officer Captain Torres spread satellite photos across the metal table, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. "The facility went dark 48 hours ago," he announced. "No thermal signatures, no radio transmissions, nothing. It's like they just vanished." Nomad studied the images, her pilot's eye catching details others missed. The compound's layout was wrong. Too many small buildings, too many power lines for a simple manufacturing operation. The surrounding terrain showed tire tracks in patterns that didn't match standard military or civilian vehicles. Most concerning were the small circular clearings scattered around the perimeter, each exactly 12 meters in diameter, perfectly spaced like landing pads. What kind of manufacturing were they supposed to be doing? She asked, tracing the unusual geometric patterns with her finger. Captain Torres hesitated. The working theory was improvised explosive devices, basic stuff. But Nomad's gut told her otherwise. The precision of the layout, the sophisticated power infrastructure, the mysterious disappearance. This wasn't some backyard bomb factory. This was something new, something dangerous, and something that was about to change everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. The morning briefing ended with standard orders. Conduct aerial reconnaissance, report any unusual activity, maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Simple enough. What they didn't know was that the facility hadn't been abandoned, it had been preparing. And in less than 72 hours, Major Kira, nomad, Voss would find herself standing in a locked-down military compound, watching the sky fill with mechanical death, with nothing but her training and a standard-issue Beretta M9 to save everyone she'd sworn to protect. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the first whispers of the storm to come. Nomad finished her coffee, crushed the paper cup, and headed toward the armory to check her gear. The irony of that moment, the last time she would enter that building as just another pilot, would haunt her for years. She pushed open the heavy steel door, unaware that in 3 days she would be standing on the other side, desperately trying to get back in while the sky above her base filled with autonomous killing machines. The weapon she would use to save them all was already there, waiting in its holster, completely ordinary and completely sufficient. The transformation of Major Kira, nomad, Voss from squadron pilot to military legend, began with a single reconnaissance flight that went sideways in ways no one could have predicted. But every legend starts with someone doing their job, and on that clear Tuesday morning, Nomad's job was to fly into the unknown and bring back answers. What she brought back instead was a war. The armory's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she inventoried her equipment, checking each item with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through countless missions. Her flight suit hung crisp and ready, her helmet gleamed under the artificial light, and her sidearm rested secure in its holster. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been for 12 years of service. But change was coming, carried on desert winds and hidden in the shadows of abandoned compounds. The next time Major Voss would see this armory, she would be locked outside, watching swarms of autonomous drones descend on her base like mechanical locusts. And the weapon that would save them all, her standard-issue Beretta M9, would prove that sometimes the simplest tools in the hands of the right person can accomplish the impossible. The mission brief was scheduled for 800 hours. Nomad had 45 minutes to prepare for what everyone assumed would be a routine surveillance flight. Instead, she was preparing for the moment that would redefine what it meant to be a warrior in the age of autonomous weapons. The sky above forward operating base Meridian remained blue and peaceful, holding its secrets close. Captain Elena, Whisper, Rays found Nomad in the armory, methodically checking her survival gear. Whisper had been Nomad's wingman for 8 months, long enough to recognize the older pilot's pre-flight rituals but not long enough to understand the intuition that made Nomad special. Where other pilots saw routine, Nomad saw patterns. Where others saw coincidence, she saw connections. "You seem tense," Whisper observed, adjusting her own flight helmet. "It's just reconnaissance." Nomad looked up from her equipment check, meeting her wingman's eyes. "Nothing's ever just reconnaissance. The moment you think it is, that's when things go wrong." The comment would prove prophetic in ways neither pilot could imagine. In less than 72 hours, Whisper would be calling out target coordinates over the radio, while Nomad stood in an open courtyard, firing precise shots at autonomous drones with nothing but iron sights and 12 years of accumulated skill. The reconnaissance mission they were preparing for would uncover a threat that would change military doctrine forever. But first, they had to survive the discovery. The facility they were about to investigate had been quiet for 48 hours, its thermal signature cold, its radio transmissions silent. Intelligence suggested abandonment, but Nomad's instincts suggested something else entirely. The compound had gone dark not because it was empty, but because it was preparing. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the flight line. Maintenance crews performed their final checks on the F-35s, their movements efficient and practiced. The aircraft themselves seemed eager for flight, their sleek forms cutting dramatic silhouettes against the brightening sky. Everything appeared normal, routine, predictable. Nomad closed her equipment locker and turned toward the exit. Behind her, the Armory's lights continued their steady hum, illuminating weapons and gear that would soon be desperately needed, but impossibly out of reach. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. The most advanced military facility in the region would be protected by a single pilot with a handgun, because sometimes the simplest solutions are the only ones available. The briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy. Pilots checked weather reports, studied navigation charts, and reviewed engagement protocols. The intelligence summary painted a picture of a mystery, but not necessarily a threat. The compound had been manufacturing something, that much was certain. But what and why it had gone silent remained unclear. Major Voss took her seat at the front of the room, her call sign, Nomad, printed on the placard before her. She had earned that name through years of finding unconventional solutions to complex problems, of taking the long way around when the direct path was blocked. In less than 3 days, that same unconventional thinking would save lives in ways no one could have predicted. Captain Torres entered carrying a stack of updated satellite photos, his expression grim. The overnight imagery showed new details, vehicle tracks leading away from the compound, suggesting recent activity despite the lack of thermal signatures. More concerning were the small objects scattered around the perimeter, objects that hadn't been there in previous surveillance passes. "Something's changed," Torres announced, spreading the photos across the briefing table. "These objects appeared overnight. They're too small to be vehicles, too large to be personnel, and they're arranged in a perfect grid pattern." Nomad studied the images, her pilot's eye trained to spot details others missed. The objects were cylindrical, approximately 2 meters in length, positioned at precise intervals around the compound. Most telling was their orientation. All pointed toward the sky, like flowers following the sun. "Launch tubes," she said quietly, the words carrying weight in the suddenly silent room. The briefing continued, but the mission parameters remained unchanged. Conduct aerial reconnaissance, report unusual activity, maintain radio contact. Simple orders for what was rapidly becoming a complex situation. What they didn't know was that the compound hadn't been abandoned. It had been automated. And the objects Nomad had identified as launch tubes were exactly that, loaded with autonomous drones designed to hunt and kill anything that moved. The morning sun reached its zenith as the briefing concluded. Pilots dispersed to their aircraft, their movements carrying new urgency. The routine reconnaissance mission had become something else entirely, though none of them could have imagined how dramatically their world was about to change. Major Kira, Nomad, Voss walked across the tarmac toward her F-35, her mind processing the implications of what they'd discovered. The compound had gone dark not because it was empty, but because it was preparing. The question was, preparing for what? The answer would come in 3 days, when the sky above forward operating base Meridian would fill with mechanical death, and the most advanced military installation in the region would depend on a single pilot with a handgun to survive. But first, they had to survive the discovery that would trigger the attack. The F-35 Lightning II stood ready, its angular form cutting a predatory silhouette against the desert sky. Nomad performed her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency, checking control surfaces, weapons systems, and communication equipment. Everything was operational, everything was ready. But as she climbed into the cockpit, adjusting her helmet and running through the startup sequence, Nomad couldn't shake the feeling that this routine reconnaissance flight was about to become something else entirely. The compound they were investigating had been quiet for 48 hours, but silence didn't always mean absence. Sometimes it meant preparation. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Nomad felt the familiar rush of impending flight. In minutes, she would be airborne, flying toward answers that would reshape everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. The sky above stretched endless and blue, beautiful and deceptive, hiding secrets that would soon be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. Ground control cleared her for takeoff, and Nomad advanced the throttles. The F-35 accelerated down the runway, its powerful engine pushing her back into her seat. The moment of liftoff was always magical, that instant when the aircraft left the Earth and entered its natural element. Today, it felt like a beginning. The flight to the target area took 43 minutes, during which Nomad's sensors detected nothing unusual. The compound appeared exactly as described in the intelligence briefings: silent, dark, apparently abandoned. But appearances could be deceiving, and Nomad had learned to trust her instincts over her instruments. Nomad, this is Whisper. I'm seeing those cylindrical objects Tors mentioned. Count approximately 30, arranged in a perfect grid pattern. Copy that, Whisper, maintaining altitude and continuing surveillance. The objects were indeed launch tubes, though their purpose remained unclear. Nomad adjusted her flight path to get a better angle, her camera systems recording everything for later analysis. What she saw made her blood run cold. The tubes were sophisticated, clearly designed for precision deployment of something aerial. Control, this is Nomad. I'm observing what appear to be multiple launch systems, possibly surface-to-air. Recommend immediate escalation to higher authority. Nomad, maintain surveillance and continue reporting. Do not engage unless directly threatened. The response was predictable but inadequate. What they were looking at wasn't a simple weapons cache. It was a sophisticated deployment system for something entirely new. The precision of the layout, the sophistication of the equipment, the mysterious timing of the compound's silence, all pointed to a threat unlike anything they'd encountered before. Nomad completed her reconnaissance pass and turned for home, her mind already working through the implications. The compound wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. The launch tubes weren't static defenses, they were delivery systems. And the silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. The flight back to base passed quickly, but Nomad's mind raced faster than her aircraft. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that terrified her. The compound had been manufacturing autonomous drones, not simple surveillance platforms, but sophisticated weapons systems capable of independent operation. The 48 hours of silence had been preparation time, during which the systems had been activated and programmed. Landing at Forward Operating Base Meridian, Nomad taxied to her assigned spot and shut down the engines. The ground crews approached immediately, beginning their post-flight inspection routine. Everything appeared normal, but Nomad knew that normalcy was an illusion. The reconnaissance flight had revealed a threat that would soon manifest in ways no one could have predicted. The debrief session was tense, with intelligence officers struggling to understand what they'd discovered. The satellite imagery was clear, but the implications were staggering. The compound hadn't been manufacturing simple weapons. It had been developing autonomous systems capable of coordinated attacks. The sophistication required was beyond anything they'd seen from irregular forces. "We need to inform higher headquarters immediately," Captain Torres announced. "This is beyond our operational capacity." But higher headquarters was 3 time zones away, and the threat was immediate. The compound had been silent for 48 hours, but that silence was about to be broken in the most dramatic way possible. The launch tubes Nomad had observed were already programmed, their deadly cargo ready for deployment. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with various officers debating response options. Some advocated for immediate airstrikes, others suggested ground reconnaissance, and a few recommended waiting for further intelligence. What none of them realized was that the decision had already been made for them. The compound's autonomous systems had detected their reconnaissance flight and were preparing to respond. Major Kira, Nomad, Voss left the debrief session with a sense of impending doom. Her 12 years of combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something terrible was about to happen. The compound's silence wasn't peaceful. It was ominous, like the quiet before a storm. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of increased security protocols and heightened alert status. The base commander ordered additional patrols, reinforced perimeter defenses, and established continuous communication with higher headquarters. But the real threat was already in motion: autonomous systems executing programmed instructions with mechanical precision. The attack began at 3:47 hours on a Thursday morning, when the first wave of autonomous drones launched from the compound Nomad had surveilled. The systems were sophisticated beyond anything intelligence had predicted, self-navigating, target-selecting, and capable of coordinated attacks. They flew low and fast, avoiding radar detection until they were practically on top of their targets. The first indication of trouble came from perimeter sensors, which detected multiple small aircraft approaching from the southeast. The duty officer initially dismissed them as birds or weather phenomena, but the radar signatures were too consistent, too purposeful. By the time the alarm sounded, the drones were already inside the base's defensive perimeter. Major Voss was in her quarters when the attack began, writing a report about the reconnaissance mission. The sound of the base alarm brought her to her feet immediately, her combat instincts activated by the distinctive wail. She grabbed her flight suit and weapons, heading for the door as the first explosions echoed across the compound. The scene outside was chaos. Autonomous drones swarmed overhead like mechanical locusts, their electric motors creating an ominous buzz that filled the air. They were small, fast, and deadly, each one carrying enough explosive to disable a vehicle or kill several people. The base's defensive systems were overwhelmed, designed to counter traditional aircraft rather than swarms of small, agile targets. Nomad ran toward the armory, her training taking over as the base erupted in gunfire and explosions. The drones were targeting specific objectives: communications equipment, vehicle pools, weapons storage facilities. Their programming was sophisticated, their coordination flawless. This wasn't random terrorism, it was precision warfare. The armory was in lockdown, its blast doors sealed, and its electronic systems offline. Emergency protocols had activated automatically when the attack began, securing the facility's most sensitive weapons and equipment. But those same protocols that were designed to protect the armory had locked out the people who needed access to its contents. Nomad reached the heavy steel door and found it sealed tight, its electronic locks unresponsive. The backup power systems were offline, the manual override controls non-functional. She was locked out of the very weapons she needed to defend the base, with nothing but her sidearm and 12 years of combat experience. The irony was perfect and terrible. The most advanced military facility in the region was under attack by autonomous weapons, and its primary defense would be a single pilot with a handgun. But as Nomad drew her Beretta M9 and assessed the situation, she realized that sometimes the simplest tools in the hands of the right person could accomplish the impossible. The first drone passed overhead, its sensors scanning for targets. Nomad tracked its movement, calculating range and trajectory with the precision that had made her a skilled pilot. The drone was small, fast, and designed to be difficult to hit, but it was also predictable, following programmed flight patterns that could be anticipated. She raised her weapon, aligned the sights, and waited for the perfect moment. The drone completed its scanning pass and began to turn, presenting its profile for exactly 2 seconds. Nomad squeezed the trigger, the Beretta's report echoing across the compound. The 9 round found its mark, and the drone tumbled from the sky in a shower of sparks and shattered components. One down, approximately 49 to go. The remaining drones responded to the threat, their programming adapting to the new variable. Several turned toward Nomad's position, their sensors identifying her as a high-priority target. But she was already moving, using the compound structures for cover while maintaining a clear field of fire. The second drone approached from the east, flying low and fast. Nomad led its movement, firing 2 rounds in quick succession. The first missed, but the second found its mark, sending the drone crashing into a nearby building. The explosion was surprisingly small. These weren't suicide drones, but precision weapons designed to disable rather than destroy. Radio chatter filled the air as base personnel struggled to coordinate their response. Most were taking cover, waiting for the attack to pass. But Nomad understood that waiting meant death. The drones were programmed to systematically destroy the base's defensive capabilities, leaving everyone vulnerable to follow-up attacks. All personnel, this is Nomad. The drones are following programmed patterns. They're predictable if you know how to read them. Target the central processor housing. It's the slightly larger compartment behind the main rotor assembly. Her voice carried across the radio net, calm and authoritative despite the chaos around her. Other personnel began to emerge from cover, small arms fire joining the battle. But Nomad remained the primary threat to the drone swarm, her accuracy and tactical awareness making her the most dangerous target. The drones adapted again, beginning to coordinate their attacks specifically against her position. 3 approached simultaneously from different directions, their programming calculating that overwhelming her defenses was the key to mission success. But they had underestimated the human factor, the ability to think creatively under pressure. Nomad analyzed the approaching threats, calculating angles and timing. She had 7 rounds remaining in her magazine, with 2 spare magazines in her gear. 15 rounds total to neutralize 47 autonomous weapons. The mathematics were daunting, but not impossible. She engaged the first drone at maximum effective range, putting 2 rounds into its central processor. The machine tumbled from the sky, its autonomous systems failing in a cascade of electronic death. The second drone adjusted its approach, but Nomad was already moving, using a maintenance vehicle for cover while maintaining her firing position. The third drone attempted to flank her, coming around the vehicle's opposite side. But Nomad had anticipated the maneuver, spinning to engage the threat as it appeared. A single round destroyed its navigation system, sending it careening into a concrete barrier where it exploded in a shower of sparks. The remaining drones began to exhibit more sophisticated behavior, their programming learning from each engagement. They started using cover, coordinating their movements, and attempting to overwhelm her position through synchronized attacks. But Nomad's experience gave her advantages that no programming could overcome. She understood that the drone's greatest strength, their coordination, was also their greatest weakness. They were networked, sharing information and coordinating responses. But networks could be disrupted, and coordination could be turned against itself. Nomad identified what appeared to be a command drone, slightly larger than the others, and maintaining a central position relative to the swarm. Its behavior patterns suggested it was coordinating the other units, making it the highest priority target. But it was also the most protected, surrounded by smaller drones that formed a defensive screen. She needed a different approach. The direct assault that had worked against individual drones would be suicide against a coordinated group. Instead, she would use the compound's infrastructure to her advantage, creating a tactical situation that favored human intelligence over artificial programming. The fuel depot was 50 meters away, its storage tanks containing thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. The drone's programming would identify it as a high-priority target, but their sensors would also recognize the danger of attacking it while their own units were in the blast radius. It was a weakness she could exploit. Nomad moved toward the fuel depot, drawing the swarm's attention. The drones followed, their programming identifying her as the primary threat. But as they approached the volatile facility, their safety protocols began to conflict with their attack programming. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but it was enough. She positioned herself between two storage tanks, using their massive bulk for cover while maintaining clear firing lanes. The drones' coordination faltered as they tried to balance their attack programming with their safety protocols. In that moment of uncertainty, Nomad struck. The command drone moved into position to coordinate the attack, its larger size making it an easier target. Nomad aimed carefully, leading its movement and accounting for wind and distance. The shot was perfect, the 9th round penetrating the drone's command module and sending it tumbling from the sky. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The remaining drones lost their coordination, their individual programming taking over as the network command structure collapsed. They began to operate independently, making them predictable and vulnerable to a skilled marksman. Nomad worked methodically, engaging each drone as it presented itself. Her movements were economical, her shots precise. Each round found its mark. Each engagement reduced the threat by one more autonomous weapon. The compound echoed with the sound of gunfire and the crash of mechanical debris. But the drones were learning, their individual programming adapting to her tactics. They began to vary their approach patterns, use more sophisticated evasion techniques, and coordinate in smaller groups. The battle was evolving, and Nomad realized she needed to evolve with it. The maintenance hangar offered better cover and more complex terrain. Nomad moved toward it, drawing the remaining drones into an environment that favored human tactics over mechanical precision. The hangar's interior was cluttered with equipment, tools, and aircraft parts, perfect for close-quarters combat. Inside the hangar, the drones' advantages were reduced. Their coordination was hampered by obstacles, their speed was limited by confined space, and their sensors were confused by the metallic environment. But they were still dangerous, still programmed to kill, and still numerous enough to overwhelm a single defender. Nomad used the hangar's infrastructure to her advantage, moving between aircraft and equipment while maintaining firing positions. The drones followed, their programming struggling to adapt to the three-dimensional environment. She engaged them systematically, using cover and concealment to protect herself while maintaining offensive capabilities. The battle continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Each engagement was life or death. Each shot had to count. Nomad's ammunition was running low, but so was the number of operational drones. The mathematics of survival were coming down to the wire. A single drone remained, its programming more sophisticated than the others. It had learned from observing the destruction of its companions, adapting its behavior to counter Nomad's tactics. The final engagement would be a test of human intuition against artificial intelligence, experience against programming. The drone approached cautiously, using the hangar's structure for cover. Its movements were unpredictable, its sensors constantly scanning for threats. But Nomad had been studying its behavior, learning its patterns just as it had learned hers. The final shot would require everything she had learned in 12 years of combat. She waited, weapon ready, as the drone maneuvered for its attack. The moment came suddenly. The machine exposed itself for a fraction of a second as it moved between cover positions. Nomad's shot was instinctive, her training taking over as conscious thought became too slow for the situation. The round found its mark, and the last drone tumbled from the sky. The compound fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens and the crackle of fires. Major Kira, Nomad, Voss had done the impossible. She had single-handedly defended a military installation against an autonomous weapon swarm using nothing but a handgun and 12 years of accumulated skill. The aftermath was chaos of a different kind. Base personnel emerged from cover. Emergency responders rushed to contain fires and treat casualties, and communication systems crackled with reports and status updates. The attack had lasted less than an hour, but its implications would reshape military thinking for years to come. Nomad stood in the hangar, her weapon empty, surrounded by the wreckage of dozens of autonomous drones. The silence was profound after the chaos of combat, broken only by the distant sounds of recovery operations. She had accomplished something that military theorists had declared impossible, defeating a coordinated drone swarm with small arms fire. The base commander arrived within minutes, his expression mixing relief with disbelief. The reports he had received seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. A single pilot had defended the entire installation against a sophisticated autonomous weapon attack, using nothing but standard equipment and extraordinary skill. "Major Voss," he said, his voice carrying new respect, "I need a full debrief immediately. Higher headquarters is going to want to understand exactly what happened here." But Nomad knew that the real significance of the event couldn't be captured in a formal report. The attack had demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional military installations to autonomous weapons, but it had also proven that human intelligence and skill could overcome technological superiority. The battle had been won not through advanced equipment, but through training, experience, and the ability to think creatively under pressure. The debrief session lasted 6 hours, with intelligence officers, tactical experts, and technology specialists all trying to understand how a single person had accomplished the impossible. The drone fragments were collected and analyzed, their sophisticated programming studied and dissected. But the real lesson was simpler. In an age of autonomous weapons, the human factor remained the decisive element. News of the engagement spread quickly through military channels, then into the broader defense community. The story of Major Kira, Nomad, Voss and her single-handed defense of forward operating base Meridian became legend within weeks. But for Nomad herself, the event was simply part of her job, protecting the people she served with, regardless of the odds. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the threat they had faced. The compound's autonomous systems had been designed to launch coordinated attacks against multiple targets simultaneously. The attack on forward operating base Meridian had been just the beginning, a test of the system's capabilities before a larger offensive. But the destruction of the drone swarm had disrupted the entire operation. The autonomous systems had been programmed to learn from each engagement, improving their tactics and coordination. The loss of an entire swarm to a single defender had created a data paradox that crashed the entire network. The compound was secured 2 days later, revealing the full extent of the threat. Hundreds of autonomous drones had been prepared for deployment, their programming sophisticated enough to conduct independent military operations. The technology was years ahead of anything Western intelligence had anticipated from irregular forces. But the real revelation was the human element. The compound's designers had programmed their systems to counter traditional military responses, aircraft, armored vehicles, coordinated unit tactics. They had not anticipated a single person with a handgun, thinking creatively and acting independently. Major Voss received the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions, but the award ceremony was closed to the media. The full details of the engagement remained classified, known only to a small circle of military personnel and intelligence officers. The world would never know how close they had come to facing a new kind of warfare, or how one person's courage had prevented it. The tactical implications were studied extensively. Military doctrine was updated to address the threat of autonomous weapon swarms. New training programs were developed, and defensive systems were redesigned. But the core lesson remained unchanged. Technology was only as effective as the people who used it. Nomad continued her military service, but her role had changed. She became a consultant on autonomous weapon defense, helping to develop new tactics and training programs. Her experience had made her uniquely qualified to understand both the capabilities and limitations of such systems. The story of her defense of Forward Operating Base Meridian was told and retold, each version adding new details and interpretations. But the essential facts remained the same. A single pilot with a handgun had accomplished what entire squadrons of advanced aircraft might have failed to achieve. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. The engagement had demonstrated that autonomous weapons were not invincible, that human intelligence and skill could overcome technological superiority. It was a lesson that would prove crucial in the conflicts to come. But for Nomad herself, the most important outcome was simpler. She had done her job protecting the people she served with. The fact that she had done it under impossible circumstances, with inadequate equipment, against overwhelming odds, was just part of being a soldier. The sky above Forward Operating Base Meridian was blue and peaceful again, but it would never look the same. The months that followed brought new challenges and new responsibilities. The autonomous weapon threat had not disappeared. It had evolved, adapted, learned from the failure at Forward Operating Base Meridian. Other attacks followed, each one more sophisticated than the last. But the defense community was now prepared, thanks to the lessons learned from one pilot's impossible victory. Major Kira, Nomad, Voss had proven that in an age of autonomous weapons, the human factor remained decisive. Her call sign, once a reference to her tendency to find unconventional solutions, had become a symbol of human adaptability and courage. The story of the pilot who was locked out of the armory and saved her base with a handgun would be told for generations. A reminder that sometimes the simplest tools in the hands of the right person can accomplish the impossible. The desert wind still blew across Forward Operating Base Meridian, carrying with it the memories of that chaotic morning when the sky filled with mechanical death. But it also carried the legacy of human courage, the proof that no matter how advanced the technology, the human spirit remained unconquerable. The battle had been won not through superior equipment, but through training, experience, and the willingness to do whatever it took to protect others. And in the end, that was what mattered most, not the technology or the tactics, but the simple truth that when everything else failed, one person had stood up and done what needed to be done. The sky above Forward Operating Base Meridian was peaceful again, but it would never forget the day a pilot with a handgun had saved them all. The legend of Major Kira, Nomad, Voss would endure long after the technical details of the engagement were forgotten. Her story would be told in military academies, studied by tactical experts, and remembered by anyone who understood that courage and skill could overcome any odds. The pilot who was locked out of the armory had become a symbol of everything that made the human spirit unconquerable. The future would bring new challenges, new threats, new technologies. But the lesson of forward operating base meridian would endure, that in the end, it was not the weapons that mattered but the people who wielded them. And sometimes, just sometimes, one person with the right training, the right mindset, and the right equipment could change the course of history. The sky above the desert remained blue and endless, holding its secrets close. But on that day, it had witnessed something special, the triumph of human courage over technological terror, the victory of training over programming, the proof that no matter how advanced the enemy, the human spirit would always find a way to prevail. Major Kira, nomad, Voss had shown them all that sometimes the impossible was just another word for not yet accomplished. The story ended where it began, with a pilot, a weapon, and the willingness to do whatever it took to protect others. The details would be studied, analyzed, and debated for years to come. But the essential truth was simple and eternal. When everything else fails, when the odds are impossible, when the enemy seems invincible, the human spirit will always find a way to fight back. And sometimes that's enough to change the world. The desert wind carried the message across the endless sky, a reminder that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. The story of Major Kira, nomad, Voss and her defense of forward operating base meridian had become legend, but the woman herself remained a soldier, ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. The sky above stretched blue and peaceful, but it would never forget the day one pilot with a handgun had saved them all. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the technology or the odds, but the simple truth that when everything else failed, one person had stood up and done what needed to be done. The battle had been won, the threat defeated, and the future secured. The story of the pilot who was locked out of the armory and saved her base with a handgun would be told for generations. A reminder that sometimes the most important victories are won not with advanced weapons, but with courage, skill, and the refusal to surrender. The legend was complete, but the reality continued. Major Kira, nomad, Voss had proven that the human spirit was unconquerable, that training and experience could overcome any technological advantage, and that sometimes the simplest tools in the hands of the right person could accomplish the impossible. The sky above forward operating base meridian remained peaceful, but it would never forget the day one pilot had changed everything.